Hello. Welcome. My name is Shauna Lipton. I'm Associate Dean of Graduate Studies here at PNCA. Thanks everyone for coming. PNCA rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. As I acknowledge that I'm a settler here on this land, I would also like to express my solidarity with the people of Palestine currently struggling for survival, self-determination, and liberation from settler colonial violence. Tonight, we are here to learn about surrealism, protest, and the defiance of societal norms from Professor Abigail Susik, whose expertise lies at the crossroads of international surrealism and anti-authoritarian protest cultures. She is the author of Surrealist Sabotage and the War on Work, editor of Resurgence, Jonathan Leake, Radical Surrealism and the Resurgence Youth Movement, 1964 to 1967, and co-editor of the volumes Surrealism and Film after 1945, Absolutely Modern Mysteries, and Radical Dreams, Surrealism, Counterculture, Resistance. As a founding board member of the International Society for the Study of Surrealism and an associate professor of art history at Willamette University, Professor Susik continues to shape the narrative and understanding of surrealism's role in the world. Her recent recognition as a fellow at the National Humanities Center for 2023-24 is a testament to her impactful scholarship. Her lecture tonight is entitled Surrealism and Wage Labor Refusal. Please welcome Abigail Susik.
Thank you so much, Shauna. I'm delighted to be here at PNCA in this beautiful room. Greetings, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a Monday night after work to hear a lecture about wage labor refusal. I really appreciate that. I also just want to thank everybody in the MA and Critical Studies program here at PNCA for supporting this lecture, all of the colleagues and the students who I've really enjoyed getting to know and working with, and also shout out to Dr. Laurel Reed-Pavick, who's an associate professor of art history here, for her collegiality. It's just been really lovely becoming, to some degree, a part of the PNCA community. And I will say that I'm very much hoping to teach a class on this subject here in the future. So hopefully that can happen. So we're live streaming, and I want to greet any guests who are here remotely, and also let you know, if you're here in the room, that I won't be budging from this spot because we are recording. So hopefully you'll be able to hear me and see me well. Please let me know if not. So let's go ahead and dive into this interesting and intriguing question. Why is surrealism relevant to the issues of wage labor and wage labor refusal? Can the modern artwork contribute to the imagining of a post-work society in which the capitalist system of wage labor or salaried labor has been surpassed by a mode of living that, drawing on advances in technology and socialized forms of income support, drastically reduces overproduction and with it excess and unnecessary labor, the kinds of energy-sucking black hole gigs that the late David Graeber called bullshit jobs, pictured here? Or are the machinations of the art world just another form of false consciousness in which renowned artists pose as free agents unlimited by kinds of economic constraints faced by most workers and producers in society today? So what, if anything, can surrealism as a dynamic and cultural social movement contribute to the discussion about this impactful role of paid labor in our lives? Starting in around 2014, these were some of the overarching questions that hounded me as I set out to write this book, Surrealist Sabotage and the War on Work, which was published by Manchester University in 2021, and I'm greatly relieved to say is now available in a much more affordable paperback version. When it was published in hardback version, someone wrote to me and said, "I have to get a second job to afford your hardcover book," which horrified me. We have to change the way that academic publishing works, so you can get it in paperback now and quit your job, hopefully. My hope was to find a kind of artwork that could unwork work as we know it, that could not just serve as the flip side or opposite of the daily grind in a paid job, but as a key to assist in the undoing of our necessary submission to participation in the system of waged labor. I was looking for the utopian horizon of possibilities for work within the framework of the work of art. But from all outward appearances, Surrealism, with its unfortunate popular reputation for spectacular entertainment a la Salvador Dali, whom Surrealist theoretician and organizer André Breton called Evita dollars because of his purported lust for money and luxury, Surrealism seemed to be, to say the least, not the most likely candidate for a study of labor-conscious artwork. But we must also say that Dali's often brilliant work remains very important to the history of Surrealism. We have some Dali scholars in the room here, so acknowledge you. And yet, it was in the year 1925 that the Surrealist declaration of a war on work was declared on the cover of their first journal, The Surrealist Revolution, La Révolution Surréaliste. Blazoned in all capitals and surrounding a Man Ray photograph of a mannequin in haute couture fashion, that became the battle cry for the movement, a slogan which I could not ignore and could not forget. What was meant by this guerre au travail that you see on the cover here? And how was the Surrealist war on work different from the anti-capitalist revolution envisioned by Karl Marx in the 19th century? So I really puzzled over this cover for a long time. The Man Ray photograph in the middle, it turns out to be a photograph taken during a paid labor gig for Man Ray, who was, of course, an art photographer, but made his living doing fashion photography. And so as a surrealist, having a job was always problematic. So they probably said, let us use some of your work for our own purposes. And they sort of sabotaged his fashion shoot with this luxurious, high-cost designer gown and use it as a kind of foil for the phrase, and a war on work. It's obviously a war on class, too. Around 7 years ago, when ideas for my book began fomenting, it wasn't yet clear that the burgeoning field of surrealism studies was about to experience an incredible expansion in the scope of research being done by scholars in different disciplines from around the world. In the last decade, a remarkable wealth of first-rate scholarship on surrealism has been published by literary scholars, film historians, art historians, curators, among others. There are so many good things to read, and I love seeing the cell phones. These are just a selection of the few things that I recommend. These are texts by surrealists themselves, such as the new novel by author Ricky Ducournay, who lives here in the Pacific Northwest in Washington, but also by scholars of surrealism and curators. And also, if you heard, we've had some really important surrealism exhibitions around the world. So the Surrealism Beyond Borders show at the Met in New York and the Tate Modern in London was in 2021, 2022. Did anybody get to go see that? Yeah, that was a little hard time to travel. But also, here's another shot from the show in New York. So that was a huge encyclopedic show, exhibition of surrealist works, very important. There's a great catalog. And also, you may have heard that the Venice Biennale last year featured the surrealist artist Leonora Carrington and her wonderful, grotesque, terrifying book of children's stories, Leche del Sueño, The Milk of Dreams. That got a lot of press for us. And I'm just going to take a moment and do a plug for the ISSS, which Shauna mentioned. The International Society for the Study of Surrealism has also been recently formed, and we have an annual conference in Houston next month, but in Paris also next year for the centenary of Surrealism, which was founded 100 years ago in Paris. So perhaps all of this activity surrounding surrealism studies has to do with the simple fact that the movement's 100-year anniversary is about to be upon us next year in 2024, and it's a remarkable feat that the surrealist movement is alive a century later. Yet it's not just this excitement about surrealism and contemporary pop culture that I want to highlight, because that may already be obvious enough to you. Instead, what I hope to convince you of is surrealism's relevance to the problem of overwork and burnout in society today. So, although as a historian I attempt to remain unbiased regarding surrealism's effectiveness or success when it came to living up to its professed anti-work ethos, for surrealism had many shortcomings characteristic of its historical period in general, but also profound ideological failings idiosyncratic to itself, I do not shy away from the bald opinion that we stand to learn something from surrealism's trenchant critique of the wage labor system and its marshaling of the work of art as a tool for the undoing of the work ethic. In this sense, I'm interested in potential benefits of a model of history that compulsively repeats itself, and also one that does not keep score, so to speak, of practical successes versus impractical and speculative postulations for the future. So as you can see, in terms of this model of history that repeats itself, or the history, a history perhaps of failures, of failures that were valiant attempts at a better future. I'm putting up here sort of a news item you may have heard about from 2022. And yes, I am showing a Fox News slide on my presentation, in which a Fox News reporter kind of bullied a leader of the subreddit group that is devoted to the topic of anti-work on the news, and it got some attention because of the very negative aspects of this interview, in which the person was humiliated, the person being interviewed here, the editor of the subreddit. And the subreddit slogan is "Unemployment for all, not just the rich." But I was really struck by the subtitle on the news item, which was "The War Against Working," as a kind of unconscious, happenstance, surrealist, if you will, déjà vu of the guerre au travail, the war on work. So, but perhaps we should start by asking, as did surrealist theoretician André Breton in the title of a noted 1934 lecture in Brussels, "What is Surrealism?" That was the lecture. And part of his answer that day was the following, quote, "Above all, we were exclusively preoccupied with a campaign of systematic refusal, exasperated by the conditions under which in such an age we were forced to live. But our refusal did not stop there. It was insatiable and it knew no bounds," end quote. Following this cue, it must be said that surrealism is not an artistic movement, nor is it limited in range to an art historical topic. Surrealism is rather a widespread and ongoing social protest movement that seeks to revolutionize daily life and the human mindset on nearly every level of existence. So one of my favorite quotes for understanding surrealism and in general comes from Breton's 1924 manifesto. So Breton was a dominant writer from the movement. And he says here, "Transform the world," said Marx, "change life," said Rimbaud. "These two goals make only one for us." So very powerful kind of compounding of ideas here from the 19th century political theorist Karl Marx and the late 19th century French symbolist poet Arthur Rimbaud. There's also, if you want to get down in nitty-gritty and read the Surrealist Manifesto, which is a pretty dense text. If you haven't read it, there are some good anti-work quotes within it that give you more of a sense of what very early on the French Surrealist group was talking about. So Breton says that with this manifesto, he's attempting to reach out to pure young people who refuse to knuckle down in the lycée, the schools, even in the workshops and the street, the seminaries and military barracks. It is to them and them alone that I am trying to defend surrealism against the accusation that it is, after all, no more than an intellectual pastime like any other. And I think this defense is still going on today. So on a basic level, surrealism is, if you didn't know, a historical phenomenon which commenced officially in 1924, as I've mentioned, but quickly spread to many other countries and cities around the world and is still alive today, with active groups in Spain, the United States, Sweden, and the Czech Republic, and many other locations. And greetings, surrealist friends who may be here. Not unlike the era of Romanticism, which encompassed much more than just the notion of an artistic school, style, or period, the wildly interdisciplinary international surrealist movement, composed of hundreds of contributors from all kinds of backgrounds, is notoriously difficult to pin down. None of the other historical avant-gardes matched surrealism in its striking resemblance to revolutionary movements such as socialism, in terms of the way in which the group ideology spread to different cells or collectives of like-minded individuals who, by and large, shared a common desire to change life as we know it decisively for the better. So thus, despite the fact that I'm an art historian, I ultimately decided in my book to analyze surrealism using social movement theory from sociology, also with labor theory and something called social reproduction theory. These are theories that are not always utilized in art history, but all relate to the notion of work or the way in which we reproduce, care, and maintenance in our lives. So I was trying to sort of fuse that problematic idea of artwork with Marxist and feminist ideas of what labor is. So in this capacity, I was certainly keeping in mind the understanding of surrealism as a twist on the 19th century category of realism in art and literature. And I was just having a conversation before the lecture on the question of capitalist realism, which I think we can also keep in mind here. In this case, surrealism would be a superior type of realism, with surreal meaning more real than the real, a kind of reality that was so real that it started to seem unreal. So this term, surrealism, therefore, is inherently paradoxical and maybe even parodical, or sort of a parody, a satire. It first embraces perceived reality only to reject that image of reality a second later. In one capacity, then, surrealism could be seen as a challenge to radical realists like Gustave Courbet, who we see on the screen here, who himself affronted the urban bourgeoisie with his massive canvases like this one, devoted to the proletariat working menial jobs on their hands and knees, or the middle class lost in a sea of conformity. Exiled though he was as a communard after his participation in the 1871 Commune coup d'etat in Paris, Courbet's art was not sufficiently revolutionary for the Surrealists. More than just boldly exposing the tragic contradictions and never-ending exploitation that characterized modernity under capitalism, as they thought Courbet had done, and they admired him for it and for his revolutionary activity, Surrealism wanted to envision possible futures. They wanted to demonstrate that the madness of our capitalist world was a problem, and then engage in something called prefiguration, which is a term that often comes up in anarchist theory. Prefiguration is an act of envisioning a revolutionized future from the moment of the present, even scenarios that might seem impossible to achieve, like the eradication of poverty or the eradication of homelessness. Building on this vision of an imagined future, prefiguration then activates small transitional movements toward the realization of such a desired reality in the future horizon. So I'm also thinking a little bit about what the scholar Robin D.G. Kelly calls revolutionary optimism. Kelly talks about revolutionary optimism as being an important correlate to revolutionary pessimism, which was actually a surrealist idea written about by a surrealist named Pierre Navy in the 1920s. So the optimism side of it would be kind of the way in which the pessimism sparks the fire for revolutionary change, and the optimism is what is needed to imagine how that change can come about under capitalism. So prefiguration, revolutionary optimism. In the hands of poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who was one of the first to use this neologism, this new word, surrealism, in his 1917 play, The Breasts of Tiresias, to be surrealist was to find impossible within the real, to uncover the ultimate surprise within the realm of the banal, to overturn the known. In his play, The Breasts of Tiresias, set in Africa, a French woman, Thérèse, decides to become a man, and her breasts float away like two balloons. She is renamed Tiresias and becomes a general and a member of parliament. Between the first and the second acts, conveniently, her abandoned husband gives birth to over 40,000 children, all in one afternoon. The gender binary and the patriarchal power structure are reversed in Apollinaire's early version of surrealism. So, of course, this word and this idea of surrealism would continue to change away from Apollinaire's idea through the interwar period between World War I and II, and over the course of the rest of the century and into our century, when, if you didn't know, in 2016, it was named Word of the Year, a horrifying honor, by Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So this is a graphic made by the dictionary design team. You can see that they're better at words than they are at pictures. It's really an ugly graphic, and I'm going to move away soon. But so do you know why this word was elected the Word of the Year in 2016? Can you tell from the pictures? it was precisely because, at least certainly within the American usage of the word surreal, there was a huge uptick in the appearance of this word in the media because of the presidential election that resulted in Donald Trump becoming president in 2016. But clearly also it had to do with the shocking and astonishing death of Prince, which for my family was a terrible, terrible day. So the news, we see lots of representations of American flags, politics, protest movements. The surreal came to mean, in this regard, a kind of passive astonishment at current events. And this has absolutely nothing to do with the goals of the International Surrealist Movement, which activated surrealism and surreality as tools for social transformation. So passivity, capitalist realism as a kind of acceptance, if that's the way you're defining it, does not have anything to do with surrealism as a movement historically. So let's get away from this image. Actually, this is not any better, this one. In the years that stretched between the beginning of the work for my book and its publication date in 2021, these queries of mine are only complexified with developments such as the non-fungible token work of art, the NFT, the most expensive of which is currently valued at over $30 million. Also, issues like the hyper-financialization of contemporary art as a type of international currency, not unlike a virtual currency like Bitcoin, the rise of a more mainstream anti-work movement, such as we have already seen with the subreddit anti-work, and the explosion of what some pundits called the Great Resignation or the Big Quit in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, a period when over 47 million Americans quit their jobs. So this is an NFT, which is a virtual work of art that can be sold for that high degree of money. And here's some news items from the pandemic era, coronavirus pandemic era, in which we see, kind of figures, statistics about the Great Resignation, which some people balk at, but it certainly was, there was a lot of quitting going on in the United States with debates about essential workers, et cetera. We have still, just from this spring, headlines about the question of flexible work that were brought about by, the remote work caused during the pandemic. And we've seen a lot of other contemporary trends that are about labor and overwork around the world. Have you heard of the Tongping movement in China? Yeah, we have a couple people who have, which is the lying flat movement. That is a protest in the People's Republic of China to the 996 working hour system, which is a common corporate expectation in China. Some of you might know about it. I hope you haven't worked under it. So it's a requirement that employees work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. So it's a 72-hour work week. That's required when you take the job, 996, horrifying. So as you can see by this kitten demonstrating lying flat, you resist this overwork. You rest, you sleep. There's a great song about it in Mandarin. You can check it out online. And I will say also last spring I was riveted to watch the protests in France in which President Macron took away from the French people 2 years out of their retirement age, their pension, right? So now instead of retiring at 62 with a pension from the state, the French people have to retire at 64. That is in comparison to 67 in the United States when you get your benefits. So, but that law went into effect despite the protests last year. So with all of this, right after the book came out, I was looking at a lot of headlines and realized that there was a strange mirroring with the surrealist time period, which I'm going to tell you more about shortly. So I did write a couple of op-eds talking, not in the case of the New York Times because they wouldn't let me talk about surrealism. They said take surrealism out, but talking about how the Great Resignation in 2020, 2021 mimicked some of, or was a sort of strange echo again of some of the things that were going on in France 100 years prior. And then the Washington Post said, sure, you can talk about surrealism, so there's a surrealist version of that. And then this is a sort of scary graphic that I went on the right, a graphic with another media posting about that idea of Benjamin Franklin dollar with coronavirus and a mask on that I think is very funny. So all of this was going on as the book was really being finished. But I do want to say that the project is deeply informed by a lot of theory that I can't go into in detail here. But if you're interested, we can talk about it later. So books like The Problem of Work by Kathy Weeks. I was very interested in Agamben's notion of inoperativity, which was related to older ideas of unworking or désœuvrement by people like Maurice Blanchot, Georges Bataille. Bataille's expenditure and excess, contemporary ultra-leftist theories and anarchist theories, such as the Invisible Committee's notion of the destituent gesture, or the kind of withdrawal as a desertion and attack at the same time. And of course, prefiguration and abolition are things that are on my mind. So what is the Surrealist war on work? Despite the fact that Surrealism has a century behind it, this movement shared many of the concerns that workers have today: problems of overwork, burnout, job precarity, low wages, and the sheer undesirability of many wage jobs that require a lifetime of commitment to working hours and limited freedom for meager pay. And here is the Surrealist group in France in 1924. It turns out that Surrealism preoccupied itself with much more than just the confoundingly elusive question of limitless desire. It must be also seen as one of the most compelling theoretical precursors to contemporary debates about work regimes. So when I talk about a post-work society, I want to clarify that I'm referring specifically to wage labor under the capitalist system, not work in general, right? So the Surrealists were not attacking what you might call care work or maintenance work. They weren't attempting to wriggle out of that kind of daily labor that is necessary. They actually were champions, as we'll see, of revolts against such sexist structures. And they were indeed interested in laziness and idleness, but I will be attempting to argue that that is actually not at the core of their anti-wage labor protest. So most of the individuals that founded Surrealism in 1924 were white, cisgender, middle-class, or upper-middle-class veterans of World War I. Although their backgrounds varied and were privileged to varying degrees, most of them could not afford to survive without some form of employment. Several future Surrealists were preparing to enter professional careers in law or in medicine prior to 1924, while others were already employed in white-collar positions by the time the movement got started. They returned to Paris from the war only to face the task of continuing their studies or finding work in a world that had been technologically and culturally transformed over the space of just a few years. The labor market that they entered, and here they are as veterans, some of them, took on a unique character during the Reconstruction period. The Surrealists confronted high inflation rates, like crazy inflation rates, and also a newly instated, bitterly contested 8-hour workday and 6-day work week, which had only just been voted into law in France after a rash of devastating wildcat and general strikes across France between 1917 and 1920. This is a kind of polite-looking strike in France, but it is a strike. While many of these veterans who would soon become Surrealists needed jobs as much as employers needed them, they nevertheless repudiated economic obligation and necessity wherever possible, literally and symbolically. Their refusal had nothing to do with the lack of available jobs after the war. So there were strikes, there was inflation, but actually there was a labor shortage in France after the armistice in 1918. There were too many jobs, partly because of the war's decimation of the population and also the massive loss of lives during the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918-1919. And France had a continually low birth rate during this era. France was really declining in numbers. And I'm showing you here an image of military men during the war masked for the virus and watching a film, trying to relax a little bit, or some kind of entertainment. So there wasn't really this distinction between essential and non-essential workers at this time. There were other distinctions in labor, definitely in terms of gender and race and class, nationality, pay, and skill set. But there were other complex intersectional factors that I think do echo some of what we're seeing today. So you have a situation in which you've got Prime Minister Clemenceau, who's reelected in 1917, who's attempting to deal with this rash of strikes that are really shaking up the country. You've got 1.5 million dead from the war, 4.2 million wounded, this is just in France, and then about 750,000 dead from the pandemic. So this is a lot going on. Meanwhile, workers have no protection, right? They're working 10 to 12-hour days, 6 to 7-day work weeks. There's no benefits. There are no laws about hours, et cetera. And yet there's a labor shortage. People, they need more workers. It's a workers' market. It's a time for change, right? Which is actually what some people thought we might have with the Great Resignation, although that's debatable now. So the French women were definitely already key populations in this domestic service, and they had also entered the textile industry in record numbers during the 19th century, and so you see French women strikers here. The development of wartime mass production and telecommunications resulted in the feminization of new areas of labor, such as machine building and office work. France had also begun to rely on mostly male immigrant labor from Southern and Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Southeast Asia as a way of compensating for wartime and post-war labor shortages. Yet, and at this time, the nation's immigrant population doubled to 3 million during the 1920s. Yet even with the addition of these other worker sectors, there was still a hard reality of unemployment for many workers. Yet, defying these social pressures about contributing to Reconstructionist efforts, the Paris Surrealist group refused to serve their country further by playing their part in the reactivation of the national economy after having fought a war they denounced. So though they were forced to be soldiers in the draft of the war, they were disgusted, they were anti-nationalist, and anti-patriotic. The trauma of the war was certainly an influence on this outlook. Many of the surrealists had witnessed the horrors of the war front firsthand. But this disavowal of careerism and the refusal of the wage labor system, and actually their total call for the abolition of wage labor altogether, was not merely a reaction against this sort of regimentation of work hours. They actually were not also only endorsing reform, right? So they weren't really interested in what was called les 3-8, the 3/8, 8 hours of rest each of work and free time. These are IWW union images from the United States from the early 20th century. They weren't interested in reform. What they wanted was, the complete rejection of the wage-based society as dehumanizing. They wanted desirable work, though. They wanted to engage creativity as a form of self-motivated and self-rewarding making or producing. So they were interested in work, just not wage labor, right? Now, if all of this sounds a lot like Marxist communism, we must see that there are differences really between them. The Surrealists attempted to align with the French Communist Party, the PCF, between 1925 and 1935, but this alliance proved ultimately incompatible, as you might know, and it was more than just a question of the authoritarian leadership of Stalin. The Surrealists were anti-productivist as well as anti-capitalist. Unlike Marxists, they did not believe that capitalism would lead to a post-capitalist society, and they were not interested in the bureaucratization and monumentalization of communal work in a communist state following the abolition of the wage labor system. So this is their official break with the French Communist Party in 1935. It's a pamphlet, and it says the time when Surrealists were right. So the Surrealist war on work is a war also on the work ethic as well as wage labor, a valorization of work as such that remained in place in Marxist writings and in the French Communist Party. The ultimate point for André Breton is not that the artist or writer desist altogether from creative or intellectual work in a neo-aristocratic celebration of dandified laziness or an anti-aesthetic disappearance of art into life. Rather, in a protest act, he says that artists and scholars should remove themselves as completely as possible from the wage system, which limits and determines artistic protection under the vicissitudes of contracted activity and the impositions of the market. So the purpose of art is not to sort of barter on the capitalist market for Breton, but actually to contribute to the social transformation of the world and the process of human emancipation. So he said that the Surrealist aim is to become specialist in revolt, who employ any means of action to disrupt the social order. And he says, quote, one can understand why Surrealism was not afraid to make for itself a tenet of total revolt, complete insubordination, of sabotage according to rule, and why it still expects nothing save from violence. So this is from the second Surrealist manifesto later in the 1920s. So this is obviously rejection of pacifism and a call for sabotage, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Sabotage, according to rule, is malicious compliance. That's when you follow your boss's rules, the job's rules, to such an extent that you actually slow down production or cause problems in the workplace. It essentially means that you're doing the minimum expected of you. Now, I'm not going to talk about sabotage a lot because there are lots of different kinds of sabotage, but I'll just show you, this is just a little handful of some of the various species of sabotage which fascinate me. But I argue that the surrealists engage in something called permanent strike. This is a permanent strike as a type of sabotage, which is a form of withdrawal as action, or the attempt whenever possible at maintaining a non-employment or a purposeful job precariousness. This is very experimental, this idea, the idea of a permanent strike, a lifelong strike. So let me tell you just a little bit about sabotage tactics. There's one type of sabotage which is known as the strike or the walkout. And this type of sabotage gained immense international notoriety in the years right before World War I and right before Surrealists came into being. Although this practice of undermining work is ancient and geographically dispersed, tied as it is to histories and discourses of resistance to chattel slavery. The word sabotage is of more recent coinage. So saboter and saboteur are words that appear in French slang or argot, at least as early as the beginning of the 19th century, around the time of the Luddite Rebellion in England, but also you have the revolt of silk workers in Lyon, France in 1834. Purportedly, that also contributed to the term sabotage because the workers used their wooden shoes, their sabots, to smash the machinery of the textile production, right? The wooden shoes became weapons for destroying machines. And I hear there's a great new book on the Luddite Rebellion, if you want to check it out. So today's common association of the saboteur as a workplace mutineer whose actions approach propaganda of the deed, which are catalytic actions for revolution, in radical symbolism did not arise as a substantial tradition in France until the mid-1890s. So sabotage as a labor tactic was very new at the turn of the 20th century. And it was wage labor activists such as Émile Pouget of the fantastic mustache here who began theorizing these policies of deliberate employee sabotage with texts such as Le Sabotage in 1911. And then this was followed up by French unions such as the CGT, which still exists today as a union, as an actual tactic that was accepted for labor struggle. It only really became concretized in France in the early, like around 1903, and then again in 1909, when you had workers destroying telegraph and telephone lines in the postal workers and telecommunication workers strikes of those years. So this is violent sabotage, the destruction of property. You had texts in this era by writers such as Georges Sorel about the general strike as a kind of mythical violence that will unite the working class in the destruction of bourgeois culture. So by the 1920s, when Surrealist saboteurs were gaining momentum for their cultural attack, this idea of slowing down work or interfering with industrial property as a means of forcing labor reform or bargaining for gains was widely known in France and the United States. In 1912, Frank Bohn, writing on behalf of the Wobblies, which is the nickname for IWW members, this international union of all kinds of workers, he said that he defined sabotage as, you can see here, the excessive limitation of output. So very much like work to rule sabotage. Pouget called it the bungling of work, purposeful bungling, which I like. And then if you know Thorstein Veblen, it's interesting, in 1919, he said that it was this conscientious withdrawal of efficiency. So sabotage wasn't always a violent sabotage, it was about slowing down production. And if you don't know about Sabotabby, the sabotage cat, he's also another amazing IWW graphic about, we have here the sabot crushing the snake of exploitation. Don't wear sabots, it hurts the snake. But Sabotabby can attack any form of exploitation with his nails and tear it apart. So it's important to note that this form of repudiation of paid work altogether, or what I'm calling permanent strike, a kind of idea of a lifetime of resisting a job or accepting job precariousness, surviving on what you can, was actually known as a technical form of sabotage in this era. It has fallen out of common knowledge. It was called le chômage volontaire, voluntary unemployment. and it was understood to be a tactic. The general strike, of course, was the most widely used sabotage tactic in the Third Republic of France. And it was because of the rise of sabotage that the Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, finally, under pressure from strikes, instituted the Semaine Anglaise, which was the 6-hour work week where you have half of Saturday off and all of Sunday. That was around in the 19th century, but it was never set into law. So some employers might have it, some workers, but not everybody. So in 1919, that became the law, and also the 8-hour day. France had the legalized 8-hour day long before we did. And that law in 1919 was brought about just almost exactly 100 years ago. So then in 1936, there were more massive strikes in France. This is a very different story, but I just wanted you to know at that time, millions of workers participated in a general strike across the country, and they succeeded in getting the 40-hour work week. So no more work on Saturdays, and the 2-day weekend. That's when the weekend was invented in 1938 in France. They also got the first paid holidays. Of course, the United States lagged behind. 4 years later, we got the weekend with the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1940. So the Surrealists were acutely aware of these struggles. They were involved in strikes, general strikes, and to some degree, wildcat strikes and riots that were anti-fascist, because in the 1930s, you have the rise of fascism along with continued labor issues in France. So although it's possible that they might have agreed with members of the IWW that the utopian demand for a 4-hour workday, or for that matter, Paul Lafargue's satirical late 19th century proposal for a 3-hour workday would have been a substantial advancement during this period, ultimately, they took an ultra-left position on the subject of wage labor. They sought its full abolition rather than endless arbitration in the short-time movement. The short-time movement is the reduction of hours. So let's go ahead and look at some artworks. How does the Surrealist work of art contribute to the formation of their notion of a post-work society? These saboteurs engaged in collective practices of play and games, including automatic writing, drawing games such as the Exquisite Corpse or the Cadavre Exquis, which is a collective drawing game, attempting wherever possible to remove the notion of autistic authorship or genius by a privileged individual from the production of art. In this regard, Surrealist techniques for play can be seen as sabotage tactics for unraveling the commodification process of creativity in the art world. Play is a form of Surrealist anti-work via something they called automatism in particular, which is the Surrealist practice of turning off the waking mind in order to tap directly into the unconscious or the realm of dreams. And this also becomes a sort of a sabotage of the working behavior of the person, the working person who is conscious at the job, who is able to fulfill the job, right? Sort of turning off the mind would allow another thing to take over. It's a type of work to rule sabotage, I argue. You become like a robot through automatism in order to sabotage the task at hand. These tactics subverted efficiency through minimal effort and exaggerated compliance to regulation, with the body demonstratively managed and made docile by certain types of work, a kind of behavioral modification that Michel Foucault called dressage, when the body is, actually I'd like to go here, disciplined for labor. And I'll come back to this picture of Simone. Especially Fordist, Taylorist models of body regulation that combined hyper-accuracy with efficiency. So Taylorism was this idea that you could actually train your body to become hyper-efficient on the job. And this is, some models of stenography of the secretary's proper position as she types. You can see that her fingers are actually taken over by the keys of the typewriter. She becomes fluid with the machine of the typewriter. If we examine these photographs of the Bureau of Surrealist Research in Paris, taken by Man Ray in 1924, we can see this the wife of André Breton, Simone, here, performing a symbolic labor in this photograph by Man Ray. She's posing at the typewriter to take automatist dictation from the unconscious. In this regard, I'm very interested in a prevalent leitmotif in French Surrealist texts of the 1920s that typified automatism, this Surrealist form of writing or flowing unconscious, as a form of stenographic transcription. And I think we can compare Surrealist automatism to the feminized boom in the secretarial industry in the Allied nations during the Reconstruction period after World War I. Surrealists have always been manifestly interested in the gendered quality of the division of labor in society, and in particular the problem of women's work, care work, and unpaid work. Although it might be tempting to accuse the Surrealists of being a boys' club of spoiled brats who never wanted to do the dishes, which maybe in some cases was true. On the contrary, we do have some clear examples of many male surrealists who were deeply invested in the idea of the murder of patriarchy and generally valorized androcide, the killing of men, or the attack on bosses and employers by vengeful women, to the extent that they made the Papin sisters into surrealist heroines. So this is an interesting story. These two sisters were maids, live-in maids, who in the 1930s murdered their female employers, saying they were abusive over the course of many years, and they killed their female employers with the tools of their work: the kitchen knife, the clothing iron, pitcher, the water pitcher, etc. The Surrealists valorized them as heroines. Along with collective surrealist practices like games and automatism, we can see surrealist art shaping a post-work society through objects, even traditionally fine art objects like paintings, that depict or symbolize or fantasize the overcoming of discipline to waged work through routes that combine pleasure and violence. Here we see a photo of the Canarian Spanish surrealist Oscar Dominguez. And here he's very interested, you can't quite see it yet on these images, with what I argue are themes of worker or artist autonomy, in French autogestion, self-management, and that he explores this idea of autonomy through themes of autoeroticism, self-pleasuring, as well as autodestruction or self-violence. In this very strange and striking painting, Machine à coudre électrosexuelle from the mid-30s, electrosexual sewing machine, there are a quasi-covert set of sexual references about women's sewing machine work. These references are corroborated by a substantial 19th century historical discourse tied to the garment industry, that actually talked about unpaid reproductive or domestic labor forces, in which the sewing machine, very strangely, I agree, figures as an involuntary autoerotic device for secondary labor force of hyper-exploited female workers. So the idea was, in the 19th century in France, there was a sexist discourse that resisted the idea that women could go into the workforce. Women were becoming seamstresses by the thousands in the mid-19th century. So there was a medical discourse that arose that said if women work on these machines, they will masturbate, that the machines will vibrate and that the women will have orgasms, the women will become infertile, the women may succumb to lesbianism. I'm not joking, this was a real medical discourse. And so the surrealists become very interested in this outdated sexist discourse about the sewing machine as a pleasure device. Dominguez plays with it here in this painting, although it's very difficult to see. With the French terminology of the machine, he has a number of kind of visual puns that are too complex to explain here. But you can read the book if you want. Also, I talk about this fascinating object, classic surrealist object, in which Dominguez explores the kind of concatenation or very uncomfortable proximity of luxury with labor, right? And I think you can see it. We have a velvet-lined wheelbarrow here, Brouette number 1 from 1936, which is that exact year in which the strikes resulted in the weekend in France, a huge year of labor change in France. So this work, also sometimes called fauteuil or armchair, is also kind of commensurate with ideas by people like John Maynard Keynes with his book, The General Theory of Employment, which talked about the way in which capitalist society is stimulated primarily by market demand in the form of consumption rather than supply or production. So there was a lot of interesting ideas about the way in which labor and consumption were tied at this time. I think this is one of the most powerful works of art ever made in response to the surrealist anti-work position. It achieves an ingenious condensation of the quintessential labor tool, the wheelbarrow, with an emblem of bourgeois domination, the chaise lounge, and more distantly, a symbol of sumptuary privilege and artistic primitive accumulation, the sedan chair. So in 1937, Man Ray, always on it, always in my book, I can't get away from him, he takes a photo of Dominguez's object activated by a model, again in haute couture, right, in high fashion gown by this amazing gown by Vianney. And she's sort of caressing her neck in one of the shots, lounging luxuriously in this velvet-lined wheelbarrow. And this is sort of a black humor activation of the object that really brings about its connotations in relationship to the class struggle, right? We have a juxtaposition of the lifelong labor of the proletariat with the lassitude enjoyed by a ruling class dependent on servants or slaves. The ruby red satin upholstery signifying listless, conspicuous consumption, or alternatively, a luxurious experience of infirmity. The interdependence of these class hierarchies is painfully exposed, as is the causality of the ties between class dominance and the accumulation of capital, both cultural and financial. The plush, sanguine interior of the chaise coaxes the pleasure of the indolent sitter, whose role is precisely not to work, but to remain a consummately possessed object of contemplation, a surplus value bespeaking the sweetness of doing nothing, dolce far niente. So I want to just sort of paraphrase this. I guess I will read it aloud. The Surrealists were rabid anti-colonialists and anti-imperialists starting in 1925. If there is an imperialist message here, and there certainly, I think it's apparent, this is in line with what had long been the Surrealist position of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialism, with a group statement such as this: the revolution first and always. Wherever Western civilization reigns, all human attachment, but that motivated by self-interest, has ceased. Money is the bottom line. But for over a century, human dignity has been reduced to the level of exchange value. It is already not only unjust, but monstrous that those who do not own property should be subjected by those who do. But when this oppression goes beyond the bounds of simple wage labor and assumes the form of slavery inflicted on populations by international high finance, it becomes an iniquity for which no massacre could begin to atone. We do not accept the laws of economy or exchange. We do not accept the slavery of work, and on an even wider scale, we proclaim ourselves in revolt against history. So very defiant. Now, in the book, I talk about a lot of other artworks that I won't go into detail about here, but you have Conrad Klapek's fascinating paintings of work machines from the 1960s. The Surrealists thought of humans as animals. They always considered the human as a type of mammal, and that as mammals, we could become programmed by work and machines. And Klapek plays with this idea of the kind of symbiosis of the machine and the human worker by allowing his sewing machines, such as here the female tyrant, to become sexualized or even humanized, right? They're anthropomorphic. They're kind of portraits of humanized machines, if you will. There's a confusion between worker and machine. Also, there are amazing surrealist works of art, such as this one by Giovanna, a 1960s Italian-French surrealist artist who is still with us today. She had a job as a secretary in the 60s, and to kill time and steal time on the job as a form of sabotage, she used her typewriter to make these automatic drawings, which are, some of them are kind of anthropomorphic. You can see forms in them, but she used her machine in this very surrealist, automatic manner. And I will say also, I talk about the Chicago Surrealist Group. They were union members in the 60s. They were part of the IWW. They theorized sabotage. They enacted actual sabotage acts on behalf of labor movements. They were actively involved in strike and protest. And so there's an exploration of that historical movement and their correspondence with Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s about the problem of wage labor and the possibility of a post-work society. So I'm going to conclude now with a brief final section. How did the Surrealists envision a post-work society? Through their artworks, protest activities, and other collective actions. It's a big question that they didn't actually really fully answer, nor will I. But I will say that one of the things that helped me understand what the Surrealist revolt could do in terms of a prefiguration of an anti-wage labor future or a post-work society would be his discussion of the Surrealist sort of realm of imagination, as what he called impassioned embrace of potential and possibility, a refusal of what is to enable what can be. And also, you can look in a number of surrealist texts by Louis Aragon, who talks about work as a form of prostitution. He says, bankers, students, workers, functionaries, servants, you are the filleters of the useful, the wankers of the need. They didn't spare any words, right? Or André Breton, who said, how I loathe the servitude people try to hold up to me as being so valuable. I pity the man who is condemned to it, who cannot generally escape it, but it is not the burden of his labor that disposes me in his favor. It is and can only be the vigor of his protest against it, from the very famous 1928 novel, Nadja. There's many, many references in the movement that discuss this position, and it takes a long time to tease them out. But one of the things that helped the Surrealists develop, not just the protest position of permanent strike and the refusal of wage labor, was someone named Charles Fourier, who was an early 19th century social utopian philosopher who's very interesting and very strange. And they discovered his works in the 40s, and it became really important after World War II for them. And so this is an image of Fourier's phalanstère, which is a type of building that was meant to house a couple hundred people to 2,000 people who were working together to live in a communal way and also love in a communal way. For Fourier, love and work were intertwined. Love and work and sex were intertwined. You could have sex on the job. You could work while having sex. It's true. It was an erotic philosophy of labor. The Surrealists were very interested in this, although there are serious issues with Fourier, such as his anti-Semitism. But there was a kind of speculative theoretical horizon once they were able to get a hold of some of the Marx writings that hadn't been published or translated until the 30s into French, or they weren't even available at all, but a text like this, The German Ideology, becomes available in French in the 30s. They could see a version of Marx that wasn't just about work. Quotes like this, where Marx and Engels talk about fishing in the morning, let's see, what is it? Hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, rearing cattle in the evening, and criticizing after dinner. This is all possible in a potential post-capitalist society for Marx and Engels. The Grundrisse as well became important for them when they got a hold of it. And eventually, as I mentioned, this guy named Paul Lafargue, who was Marx's son-in-law, who wrote an incredible text called The Right to be Lazy in the 1880s. All of these things helped them develop their position, but it wasn't conclusive, and we can't say that it's all related to certain texts like Max Weber and the Protestant ethic. It's a complex, changing position over time that the Surrealists had, and they never really stop exploring the way in which they can expand this position. So we will stop there with just one quote from Antonin Artaud, who had been a member of the group in the 1920s. He asked of them in 1927, after he left the movement in a big huff, he said, did Surrealism, in order to survive, really need to take the form of material revolt, to identify itself with various demands concerning the 8-hour day or the readjustment of wages or the struggle against the high cost of living? The Surrealists said emphatically in reply to Artaud, yes. Thank you.
I have a microphone. If anybody wants to ask a question, please raise your hand.
And I'm happy to flip back to other images as we talk.
Everyone take a moment. Take it in.
Although the book is written, it's never done. So I would love any feedback you have, questions, critiques, etc., especially from Marxists.
As best I can with my, oh God, I hate microphones. I'm going to wrestle this together as best I can with my brain all full. I guess what I'm thinking about is, in essence, at the time that a lot of this was being written, I don't think that being an artist was seen as something like a favorable occupation. It was, if you told your parents, oh, I'm going to go be an artist, it was like, you're going to die in the streets. You'd be better off going to do factory work. Nowadays, I think there is a level of prestige or even a level of commodification that has come out of art, both in the secondary market, through avenues like social media, art markets, etc., where I guess I'm just like, I'm thinking and I'm listening and I'm like, are we able to create in a way where we're able to take this stance because somebody else would just replace us who is willing to be commodifiable? For every Breton, there is a Jeff Koons.
Yes.
And, it's like, is that modern condition considered in the writing?
Okay, in the surrealist writing, and is your question also a little bit, is it futile to pursue such an idea?
I don't know if futile is a word that I would want to use.
Okay.
I guess I would just be curious about like how the actions or how you believe the actions would have shifted from the actions of the surrealists at that point in time to now.
To today. Okay, yeah, and I tried to address that a little bit when I brought up the ever, puzzling NFT issue. The question of the financialization of art is really on people's minds today in my field of art history or contemporary criticism. How could we not, right? If you're doing art history, you're essentially doing a history of luxury commodities. If you're doing contemporary art history or you're a contemporary artist, and let's say you make it, you are going to be, that's what you're dealing in. And it is the world of extreme wealth, right, and power. So I hope you don't mind me staying here with these NFTs. They always make me smile. It's a totally different world. I make comparisons between them, and there were similarities between, let's say, the 1920s, this incubation period of surrealism, to today, and the situation of the artist. But then again, also there's like no way to compare. And as you probably know, a lot of the surrealists initially were writers and not visual artists. And I'm actually working on an essay right now about this problem of visual art and surrealism, because in the 20s, Breton writes about surrealism and painting. He doesn't say surrealist painting, he says surrealism and painting. At the same time, he's writing an essay called The Last Strike, which is calling for art workers, knowledge workers, as we would call them today, not white-collar workers, but people who are in the culture industry, to go on a strike for a couple of years and not make any artwork. As a way of making a kind of general strike statement that if all artists stopped making work, then finally maybe they would get the recognition they deserve and they would get some pay, right? So it's actually I argue, one of the earliest kind of iterations of the notion of an art strike that we have, although the literature hasn't recognized that. There are much more famous versions of art strikes over the course of the 20th century. So, and within that idea is this possibility of, well, is art as a thing, and this is very hard for some people to imagine, but is art as a thing in itself capitalist inherently? So what do we call the kind of making before capitalism? Is that art, or is art, fine art, tied to this system that we're in now of the monetized exchange of value through commodities, right? Maybe we want to call what the cave dwellers did something else, something that's not art. Then if you can imagine that, there's a horizon in which art itself ends. If art is tied to capitalism, there could be also an abolition of art. So these are ideas that were also very experimental that they were playing with, that I don't see many remnants of today in contemporary art. But it is there. Like Dali is the Jeff Koons of the 30s, and 50s. And I did actually work for Jeff Koons in the 90s, so I feel like I can say this. The problem is there. Surrealism's like uncomfortable proximity to the birth of graphic design and advertising. There's amazing game show footage of Dali, the cover of Time Life, et cetera. And I'm sorry, I really admire Dali, actually. I think he was a genius, to use a very not surrealist word, but he's the easiest example. So it was, and they kicked him out of the movement for it. They kicked him out. So I think it has to be understood as a dialectic. Like the problem won't be solved, and that's why it's a revolutionary horizon that's almost impossible. And yet they insisted that we have to find a place for the impossible despite that, right? So they said we can't just be miserabilists. That was Breton's term for capitalist realism used in the problematic way. We can't just accept it. We have to do something. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but in terms of today, I mean, I think it just would have been, if they were here, the original French surrealists, and we do have surrealists today, that part of the art world would be completely off their radar. They would be just completely not involved in it at all. So living surrealists today are small groups of friends who make works and give them to one another as gifts. They do not, if possible, participate in anything like the high finance art world. Although I think to some degree they might be interested in technologies like AI. And that's another subject.
Thank you.
Did the best I could with that. It's more of a conversation, really. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a really interesting talk, and I'm excited to read your book. As you were talking, I was thinking about, I couldn't help but think about Dada.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could take us back and talk about the relationship between Dada artists and Surrealism, what the distinction was.
Great question. Sure, I'd love to. Yeah, and I could go to that kind of more introductory slide I had about Surrealism. Maybe I'll do that. So I think of Dada, well, let's say this. I think of Surrealism as kind of the descendant of Dada, and Dada as a kind of proto-Surrealism. So Dada was also an international movement that begins during World War I. Right, it begins in Switzerland when you have people who were essentially refugees coming from different countries to get away from the war, because Switzerland was, as it is still today, not involved in World War I. It was not a warring country. And so you had people coming from Germany and Romania and northern France, et cetera. Actually, Lenin was there at that time too in Zurich. And they come together in a kind of cafe space and have a performance group in Zurich. And that is the birth of Dada. It's performative, it's musical, it is interested in the breakdown of language and the protest of war. But then it blossoms out into different cities, and you have Berlin Dada, you have a Paris Dada in the 1920s, and then you have Dada in New York and other pockets as well, and Cologne and Hanover. Paris Dada, almost every member of Paris Dada became a surrealist. So the group just kind of folded over into Surrealism, and there were lots of breaks and fights, including broken arms and people being attacked with canes. There was fighting within the group. It was a different time, maybe, but they just. And I don't know if you're asking about anti-work positions in Dada, because that was a thing specifically, but I think it really was for these French Dadaists about having served in World War I. They were veterans. Breton, let me go to my veteran slide. Breton in particular was studying as both of them, Breton and Aragon here, early members of the French group, were studying as doctors. And Breton was working with the war traumatized before they had a word for shell shock. He was working with the soldiers that had PTSD, and was seeing what happened to their brains as a result of constant fire, particularly of heavy artillery in World War I. Heavy artillery was a feature of World War I, really for the first time, as well as gassing and trench warfare. And so there was a huge degree of PTSD, very severe. And he was studying psychiatry because of this and trauma. He was very interested at an early time for a Frenchman in Freud, who was just being translated into French. And so he comes back from the war. He's engaged in Dada. All of them are. They're totally, Dadaists. They have a Dadaist magazine called Literature. But as people start to die, and I think as the pandemic comes on, I argue, it's not enough. They really need something to grapple with the death and the kind of haunted nature of death after World War II. This is my reading of it. And Surrealism, with its interest in the unconscious, allows for that. So they wanted to go inside, and they were certainly revolutionary. My project is about the world outside, but they were focused on changing the world outside by going inside. They wanted to address the mind, the human mind, as a problem. Individually, each human, if the mind could be changed by accessing your fears, your inhibited desires, your fantasies that are buried and repressed, then individually, if you did that, maybe collectively there would be change. So they actually thought they could change things. The Dadaists, I don't believe that was ever part of their program. I was
thinking specifically too about the art objects and how Dada was so much about removing the artist's hand and that relationship with wage refusal. I just saw some ties there, but I didn't know that the evolution there.
It's there. It's really there, especially in Paris Dada. And I could show you some early Man Ray objects. There's one called the Gift, which is an iron for ironing clothing. It's just a piece of metal that has nails in it. You know that work? So if you ironed anything with it, you would rip it up. But it's also like a terrifying weapon. The anti-work position was established there, and I talk about it a little bit in a genealogy chapter of the book. Also, Marcel Duchamp, who is in, I have about 8 million slides on this presentation if you want me to go to it, but Duchamp and his refusal of work is really key. Of course, Marcel Duchamp is neither Surrealist nor Dada. He kind of goes in between, but he's a key to all of this, his interest in laziness. Thank you for the great question.
Well, we're talking about groups that were somewhat overlapping or could be seen in relationship. I'm curious the relationship between the Surrealists and the Situationists.
I knew you were going to say that. Okay, yes.
And whether or not that is fully overlapping, whether they considered themselves Surrealists, whether the Surrealists considered them. Yes. Etc.
Oh, I love that question. And maybe some of the things I was saying about the abolition of art queued that up for you. Yeah, that's something I'm working on, and we've got some great scholars in the field who are experts on SI, the SI International, and have articulated that much better than I can. Mikkel Bolt Rasmussen has written, many things now at this point on surrealism and the SI, and the book Radical Dreams. I have a copy of it here if you want to look. There's a chapter on that. And so I don't think I have any good images that would illustrate that, but the Surrealist International is a group that comes up in France starting in the 50s, and it's building out of a couple of other groups that are post-war groups that are interested in pre-war ideas like surrealism. And there's this guy named Guy Debord who is steeped in Marxism, and over the course of the 60s becomes more and more radicalized and more Marxist. And so the SI and its full formation in France and in other countries, because it fans out to several other countries, is an absolutely a revolutionary project, right? It's a radicalist, ultra-leftist group that is nevertheless quasi-artistic. I hesitate to use that word because they're interested in the death of art. They see art as a product of capitalism. And so just giving background if you don't know. So basically, I would argue that they were deeply inspired by surrealism, especially Debord, and yet at the same time, in a pretty kind of punk rock way, refused it. So they absorb it, they take it in, they actually imitate it. A lot of their concepts are taken from surrealism. Détournement, I have an article that's not yet published on détournement. It comes up in surrealism starting in the 20s. I can't get it published for some reason. Maybe all the fans of SI don't want to see that. But détournement, which is sort of the overturning of an object's use, or sabotaging, really, of an object's intended function to make it something else. So what's a good example of détournement?
The iron with the nails in it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, voila. Yeah, there you. And thank you. Now maybe I'll get published. Thanks, Shauna, for that. Yeah, but also the. Have you heard of the this kind of geographic drifting that the Situationists did? Right. That's also a surrealist idea. And, you're like, of course she was going to say that. She works on surrealism, but it's true. They were interested in the dérive, which is a surrealist idea of wandering. wandering, the derive, the drift is the spatial or geospatial correlate to automatic writing and drawing, right? You wander in space, which allows the unconscious to take over your unconscious and maybe the unconscious of the city space or the unconscious of others. So, but then, but they also completely reject it and say, the surrealists failed in their mind because they still wanted art. The surrealists still believe that art could save us. The situationists say that art cannot save us, art must die. And they are, very influenced by May 68 protests. The surrealists were there too in 68. But they have no hope for any kind of iteration of capitalist artistic gestures. We have to have the revolution first. This is my understanding. Do you agree with this? Yeah. So that sort of linchpin was holding on to art as a potential space of freedom and resistance.
More movements we can ask Abigail about?
I also just realized while you were speaking, I was like, wait a second, we've talked on Twitter before. So anyway.
The broader community, and there are many people here online too, so
I just connected the thing in my brain.
That's awesome. Nice to meet you.
I think my question is, this is a moment of heightened, very politicized labor movement in the United States for the first time in decades.
Totally.
And also heightened crackdowns. I had to look up the name of it, but the Glacier Northwest ruling, which came recently, which ruled in favor of the corporation, not the labor union, who who let concrete dry in the trucks to sabotage the trucks.
Oh, thanks for mentioning that.
And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the corporation and against the labor union's right to refuse to do work during their strike, and thus ruining all the trucks. So anyway, just as an example of I think we are mounting toward with UAW and all of these labor unions that are going on strike, more public support and also harsher crackdowns. And I'm curious what you think. I also encounter more anti-work sentiments versus valorization, as you mentioned, of work in anarchist communities than I do in Marxist or communist communities. And I want to know if you think that there is a future possibility for there to be a return of interest and collaboration with art and the labor movement, because right now I don't see any particular interest from either to the other.
So many great topics there. Yeah, I mean, the upswing of strike action right now fascinates me. And I had argued in that op-ed in the New York Times, optimistically, that maybe at least the Great Resignation, if it was a thing, or at least with people quitting, if there's a market that favors workers, you've got that leverage, right? So there was leverage certainly in 2021, and then that could be a great time to make some significant change, because even though we had the 8-hour work, we got the 8-hour workday, we have the weekend, not very long now, 80 years, but who's actually really doing that, right? Gig labor, wages, it's a mess. We're all working. I mean, I work constantly. I'm a breastfeeding mother. It's my problem in a way. I'm a workaholic, which is why I wrote about this. But, it is impossible not to work. And we work when we're on social media, we're working. We all know that. But so, the strikes that are going on in so many sectors are exciting, but also for me, I agree that the system, apparently Biden is a supporter of unions to some degree, as we saw recently with the UAW, right? But, this country does not allow the general strike is illegal here. And that is a history I'd like to know more about. From what I understand, you cannot have there could be no general strike. So we are up against, it is just, I think what happened in France in 1919, I don't know if that could be accomplished right now. I don't mean to be a pessimist, but So in terms of anarchists versus communists, I know this wasn't your question, but circles, I want to address this because often my work and this book do get a lot of critiques from Marxists and in its reviews. Some of them were, saying that this was a problem and seeming to forget that Stalin existed over the course of the 20th century. But yes, surrealists initially were anarchists, and then they moved into communism in the 20s and 30s because they thought there's a party here, there's a change for revolutionary possibility. So they moved away from it because of totalitarianism. But it comes back, the anarchism in the 40s and 50s. Now, in terms of art, you probably know much better than I do whether labor movements could benefit from what we could call art, and whether that's happening. I don't know whether contemporary labor movements or unions or collectives, anarchist collectives, socialist groups, are using art in really powerful ways, other than some things I can think of, like collective forms like projection mapping. I know some protesters, and I'm interested in this, who use large-scale illegal projections on buildings in order to make kind of artistic interventions. I have not seen that being used for strike actions. I will say that, if I can get to it, the Chicago Surrealists, that chapter of the book is great because they talk specifically about how, and they enact it, sorry for the flipping here, how art is a sabotage tactic. They theorize art as sabotage, and then they talk about sabotage itself as a creative act. So they talk, Franklin Rosemont here in the middle, talked about how some workers in a cat food factory dyed all of the cat food green. And he thought this was very creative and funny and, and artistic in a way. So I think that they were looking for that, and they loved this IWW tradition of song and art and Carlos Cortez and, all of this. There was so much a tradition of sort of solidarity in art and song and craft in the IWW, and they were looking to revive that. And they still are active today. Just wrote with one of them today, Penelope Rosemont. So they would say it's there, but I can't answer in a larger fashion if it is. Do you know if it is? Yeah.
I mean, partly I'm asking because I'm like, I guess I am a Marxist, and I'm like more interested in, I come from a social practice art making context. And there's like examples in social practice or socially engaged art, like Meryl Latterman Euclid, like writing her manifesto in the 60s,
right,
and then making all the work about labor. Like that's like that's like maybe my favorite example in art history. And I'm inspired by that a lot. And then I think about like the contemporary like political artists like Tanya Bergera, who's making like useful art.
Yes.
Where like everything I do is art, everything I say is art, or whatever. I forget what that quote is, but it's like everything that I name my art as my art, and it doesn't really matter if it like looks like art to you. I don't care. Right. Kind of thing. So like if I want to like take my money and like give a bunch of immigrants like money to do projects or something, like then that's art. Which I'm like not that interested in that kind of like I don't know. That's not what I'm asking about. Like I think there's like conceptual wing of art that is doing stuff like this, but it's like it's not aestheticized, and so it doesn't reach the general public. Then it just becomes art that talks to other artists because they think it's like a nice intellectual conversation to have with each other in like academia or something. But it's like not, it's like I want a mass movement. I want to revolt in mass. And like I think art could be useful for that, and I just see like the severe lack of like that kind of activity.
Thank you so much. I wish I had some images because of that whole horizon of contemporary art is fascinating and really exciting and totally informed what I do. And, I mean, I had a picture of Silvia Federici's books up, I think, previously. And, Silvia is not an artist, but I think a lot of artists you mentioned are influenced by her work, a kind of Marxist feminism that would talk about care work and maintenance work. Social reproduction is a gendered labor, is a really, really important strand for me. Who's Federici, who was a co-founder of something called the Wages for Housework movement that influenced Latterman Euclid and others. So I mean, I don't think that the kind of art world isolation in terms of discourse of that kind of work by Latterman Okeles necessarily reduces its effectiveness or its importance. I think it's there and it's inspiring you and others. Hopefully, that history will continue to leak out into a more common knowledge. And so I think we can have it both ways. But I agree that it would be really interesting to see artists, contemporary artists, working more directly with labor activism and strike actions. I don't know that exists, and maybe if somebody in the room does. But to what degree is art that is interested in positions of refusal or protest actually activist? And to what degree is activist art taken seriously as high contemporary art on the market? This, and maybe Bruguera would count, and I think that maybe we could probably think of some other artists who are activists. But that model has not been, and the Surrealists weren't all activists either. I mean, many of them weren't. So I accept the shortcoming there. The Chicago Surrealists were activists. They were absolutely activists first before they became Surrealists. But is that actually possible? Maybe only for the artists who have already reached that level of elite recognition. They have the freedom to engage in an activism, and maybe even this week or these last 2 weeks with protest positions, we will see more of that kind of staking out a claim or a stance that cannot be avoided, right? That we can't just play the game of art anymore. We actually need to say something about what we feel and do. I'm from Florida, so my practice of history is becoming radicalized as I see what's happening in my state with DeSantis. It is not possible anymore for me to be neutral in my position. So I can't speak, I'm not an artist, I can't speak for artists, but I wonder if more and more people will see a very uncomfortable, impossible, and untenable connection between the market and their positions. I hope I spoke to that as well. Okay, more of a question than an answer. Thank you for these wonderful questions. I so appreciate it.
Hi, that was an excellent talk. Thank you. Something you said in response to a prior comment led me to wonder, were there clandestine surrealists or maybe quasi-surrealists at work in the Soviet Union or other non-capitalist economies? And if so, how did they respond to the question of work?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah, it could have been a whole new chapter of the book, and I'm thinking about that. So not that I know of in the USSR. There were active critiques coming onto the French surrealists from Russia, although some of the surrealists did. Like Aragon leaves the movement and becomes a Stalinist I will say he's a member of the PCF. So not that I know of there, but later in the 20th century, you have a really close connection between surrealists in Europe and the United States and elsewhere with surrealists in countries like Cuba that are revolutionizing. You also have surrealist groups in totalitarian surviving or even coming up under totalitarian regimes, which is very interesting, such as Argentina and Peru in the 70s. Now, those not necessarily Marxists, but Cuba is probably the best example, and maybe Eastern Europe in the 60s and 70s with the changes that were happening there after World War II in terms of people living within nations that had become communist, as you say, have a communist state, communist government. Now, in terms of Cuba, it's a complex history. Essentially, what you have is surrealists rallying behind Cuba, rallying behind the revolution, rallying behind a Marxist Cuba. You don't so much have Marxists in Cuba who are becoming surrealists, right? So there are Cuban surrealists before that revolution who are interested in continuing the Cuban Revolution, but they had already been surrealists before that time. Is that okay? And then, so that's a really important instance of people living within communist states who empathize with surrealism. And I think to some degree, you might have people in, I don't know of anyone in Eastern Germany at that time who would be calling themselves a surrealists. And I think to some degree in the Czech Republic, and in Hungary or Romania during eras, particularly the Czech Republic, of communist occupation, at least. But that history hasn't really been told. So there are Communist Party member surrealists, but it are fewer people operating under those states that would be surrealists. But you do have a surrealist under totalitarian fascist regimes, which I think some people are working on. I'm hoping in my next book to write about a group called Signo Ascendente in Buenos Aires, Argentina during the 70s under the dictatorship, who survived. And also this happens in Peru in the same era. I hope I answered your question decently. Okay, and it's a great question, and I want to know more now. So apologies to surrealists out there who are thinking she's missing something. It's a very complex movement, and I might have missed some facts there, but I'm going to look into it.
You good for a last question?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. Within your approach to pedagogy and research and writing, where does play and sabotage enter into your own labor?
That's such a good question. So in the book, I start chapter 2, which is about automatism as a form of sabotage, and my interest in white-collar labor being encoded into the images of surrealist automatic writing and thinking, and which is a very complex thing. So I'm interested in this sort of secretarial aspect of Simone. But this all came up for me while I was teaching. I was teaching a 100-level class at Willamette University, a survey of, where you have one day for surrealism for students who have never taken art history before. And this image was on the screen, and I was like, blah, 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 automatism, trying to describe it. And one of the students said, this is probably like in 2013 or 2012, raised their hand and said, why is the woman the one at the typewriter? And I'm going to answer your question more directly. And I was like, I didn't know what to say. And there's so many things you could say, right? So that actually became the question that started the book. But that was also play for me because I didn't know the answer. Because I started the book without having an idea of where it was going. And so it was like jumping into a pool or into the ocean. I'm a Floridian again. So, rather than starting from a place that I felt really comfortable with, I was actually very uncomfortable and didn't know what the book was about for a long time, which is why it took me 10 years to write. And so that became a creative process by which I had to discover what I wanted to know. I'm looking at Jason Lee here, who we're working on your thesis right now and talking about ideas. I had to let myself play and imagine and be really uncomfortable. And so I do experience scholarship and research as creative. A colleague of mine named Gavin Parkinson, who writes beautiful things on surrealism in England, recently asked me if my research was influenced by the surrealist idea of objective chance, which is a little bit like that idea of the dérive where you drift. Objective chance means that, you could just be in any situation and all of a sudden a kind of, strange occurrence might come up spontaneously, something that seems meant to be, but it is not, seems significant, you're not sure why, it's totally random. And so my answer was yes. I go into the sources, and when you're a historian, there's a whole forest of sources. It's bewildering. And then you let yourself drift in the sources and you come up with things like erotic sewing machines, and that are a little, some people are a little incredulous about this interest of mine in secretaries and sewing machines. But I just refused to not follow the path of thinking about automatism in relationship to the secretary, or thinking about surrealist sewing machines in relationship to work and self-pleasure as a form of sabotage. So it was a blast, actually, just being like, I'm going to talk about masturbation for, an entire chapter 4, and masturbation with sewing machines. Like, who would have thought? So I hope that's does that answer your question? Okay. We can talk about it more later if you want.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Shauna. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.